The question is, shall it be in order to consider and debate under the impeachment rules any motion to subpoena witnesses or documents? The yeas and nays are required under Senate Resolution 483. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander?
No.
No. Ms. Baldwin?
Aye.
Aye. Mr. Barrasso?
No.
No. Mr. Bennett? Aye. Mrs. Blackburn? No. Mr. Blumenthal? Mr. Blunt? No. Mr. Booker?
Yes.
Aye. Mr. Bozeman? No. Mr. Braun? No. Mr. Brown? Aye. Mr. Burr? No. Ms. Cantwell? Aye. Mrs. Capito? No. Mr. Cardin? Aye. Mr. Carper? Aye. Mr. Casey? Aye. Mr. Cassidy? No. Ms. Collins? Aye. Mr. Coons? Aye. Mr. Cornyn? No. Ms. Cortez Masto? Aye. Mr. Cotton? No. Mr. Kramer? No. Mr. Crapo? No. Mr. Cruz? No. Mr. Daines? No. Ms. Duckworth? Aye. Mr. Durbin? Aye. Mr. Enzi? No. Ms. Ernst? Mrs. Feinstein? Aye. Ms. Ernst, no. Mrs. Fisher? No. Mr. Gardner? No. Mrs. Gillibrand? Aye. Mr. Graham? No. Mr. Grassley? No. Ms. Harris? Aye. Ms. Hassan? Aye. Mr. Hawley? No. Mr. Heinrich? Aye. Ms. Hirono? Aye. Mr. Hoven? No. Mrs. Hyde-Smith? No. Mr. Inhofe? No. Mr. Johnson? No. Mr. Jones? Aye. Mr. Kane? Aye. Mr. Kennedy? No. Mr. King? Aye. Ms. Klobuchar? Aye. Mr. Langford? No. Mr. Leahy? Aye. Mr. Lee? No. Mrs. Loeffler? No. Mr. Manchin? Aye. Mr. Markey? Aye. Mr. McConnell? No. Ms. McSally? No. Mr. Menendez? Aye. Mr. Merkley? Aye. Mr. Moran? No. Ms. Murkowski? No. Mr. Murphy? Aye. Mrs. Murray? Aye. Mr. Paul? No. Mr. Perdue? No. Mr. Peters? Aye. Mr. Portman? No. Mr. Reed? Aye. Mr. Risch? No. Mr. Roberts? No. Mr. Romney? Aye. Ms. Rosen? Aye. Mr. Rounds? No. Mr. Rubio? No. Mr. Sanders? Aye. Mr. Sass? No. Mr. Schatz? Aye. Mr. Schumer? Aye. Mr. Scott of Florida? No. Mr. Scott of South Carolina? No. Mrs. Shaheen? Aye. Mr. Shelby? No. Ms. Sinema? Aye. Ms. Smith? Aye. Ms. Stabenow? Aye. Mr. Sullivan? No. No. Mr. Tester? Aye. Mr. Thune? No. Mr. Tillis? No. Mr. Toomey? No. Mr. Udall? Aye. Mr. Van Hollen? Aye. Mr. Warner? Aye. Ms. Warren? Aye. Mr. Whitehouse? Aye. Mr. Wicker? No. Mr. Wyden? Aye. Mr. Young? No. Mr. Blumenthal? Aye.
Are there any senators in the chamber wishing to change his or her vote? If not, the yeas are 49. The nays are 51. The motion is not agreed to.